Salam, peace be upon you. We have arrived at a delicate threshold, and I want you to feel it the way you feel the edge of a cliff when the wind suddenly goes quiet. Up to now, from episode 1 all the way to episode 13a, we have walked backward through everything we usually assume, until we reached the silent floor beneath assumption itself. We did not do that because we love abstraction. We did it because every time we start with the familiar, particles, forces, spacetime, energy, even the word universe, we secretly borrow a whole library of hidden permissions. We borrow the permission that reality is readable. We borrow the permission that differences can be detected. We borrow the permission that patterns can be shared. We borrow the permission that knowledge can exist publicly rather than privately inside one mind. Episode 13a took us to the place where those permissions are no longer borrowed. They are exposed. They are purified. They are tested. They are held in the open. But silence by itself is not a world. Silence is not a map. Silence is not even a sentence. Silence is the capacity for a sentence, and that is priceless. But it is not enough to carry a civilization. A silent ground without a language is like an ocean without a compass. Real, vast, and yet unusable. You cannot navigate it together. You cannot correct each other. You cannot even disagree cleanly, because you will be fighting about words rather than structure. So the next move is not optional. It is demanded by everything we have done so far. That is why episode 13b exists. Episode 13b is not new cosmology. It is not the next claim. It is the moment we put a grammar in the listener's hands. It is where Holophase stops being something you admire and becomes something you can operate. A language is not decoration. A language is a machine. It decides what can be said, what cannot be said, what counts as the same sentence in different clothing, what counts as nonsense, and what counts as a genuine new fact. Think of the simplest human example. Two villages live on opposite sides of a mountain. They see the same sky and drink the same rain. But one village has a single word for blue and green together, and the other has two separate words. When they try to describe a river, one insists, the river is blue, and the other insists, no, it is green. And for a while, they think they disagree about reality. But their disagreement is not in the water. It is in the language. The river has not changed. The grammar changed how they carve the world into speakable pieces. And the only way to resolve it is not by shouting harder, but by clarifying what each language permits and forbids. Holophase is more severe than this. We are not arguing about colors. We are building a method to speak about the skeleton of an expressed universe without smuggling in assumptions. If our grammar is not sealed before differentiation begins, then differentiation becomes a dream. We will smuggle geometry. We will smuggle time. We will smuggle objects. We will smuggle meaning. We will drift, and the drift will be invisible because it will be hidden inside the words we use. Episode 13b is the antidote to invisible drift. So let me give you the whole picture of episode 13b, not as a list, but as a landscape you can walk through. You will feel where the ground is solid, where it is forbidden, where it is local, where it is global, and why every step we take later must pass through this gate. Episode 13b is the pure phi language. It is the smallest set of tokens and rules that lets us describe phi structure without importing anything else. No metric, no dynamics, no apparatus, no measurement theory, no uncertainty bureaucracy, no constants as inputs, no secret space-time stage. Only phi, its derivatives where derivatives are meaningful, and the topological closures that arise because phi is cyclic. If that sounds strict, good. Strictness is what makes a language usable. A pure language is like a clean knife. It cuts where it cuts, and it does not pretend. A pure language is like clean glass. It lets you see structure without adding color. At the heart of this language is a single primitive, phi. You can picture phi as a dial, a compass, a circle. Not a number line that stretches forever, but a wheel that returns. That return is not poetry. It is the source of integers. It is the source of discreteness. It is the source of countable reality born from continuity. The circle is the first discipline. It forbids absolute beginnings and absolute ends. It tells you that whatever you claim must survive the fact that the dial can be rotated with no public consequence. Now, where does phi live? It lives on events, on a domain we call X. But in the pure language, X is not a physical stage with rulers and clocks built in. X is only the minimal support needed to make local and overlap meaningful. Think of X as a cloth before any pattern is painted on it. The cloth has neighborhoods and overlaps. This patch touches that patch. But it does not come pre-printed with a grid. If you import a grid too early, you have already decided what distance means, what time means, what motion means, and you will never know whether those meanings were discovered or assumed. So the language begins with humility. You are allowed patches, and you are allowed overlaps, and that is it. If geometry appears later, it must appear as a compression of stable phi relations, not as a gift we assumed. Then comes a rule that sounds simple, but is one of the strongest seals in the entire program. There is no absolute phi. If I add the same constant shift to phi everywhere, nothing publicly meaningful is allowed to change. This is not a symmetry of nature we discovered. It is the minimum requirement for public knowledge. If your statement depends on an absolute phase that no one can operationally anchor, then your statement is private poetry. Holophase is public science. In everyday language, the gauge quotient rule means you are not allowed to claim that the universe is at 17 degrees on an invisible dial. You are only allowed to claim relationships, differences, closures, patterns that survive shifting the whole dial together. This single rule purifies the language more than 1,000 arguments, because it prevents the oldest trick of the mind, inventing invisible absolutes and calling them explanations. Now we face the next obstacle, differentiation. You cannot take derivatives on a circle the way you take derivatives on a line, because a circle wraps. If you compute gradients directly on wrapped values, you will invent cliffs where none exist. You will see false jumps, false singularities, false chaos. So the language introduces a discipline that is not optional, the phase lift. A lift means that on a small enough patch, small enough that you do not wrap around, you temporarily unwrap the circle into a real line. You do not change phi, you choose a consistent representative of it on that patch. It is like taking a globe and choosing a seam so you can lay a local region flat. The seam is not the Earth, it is your representation. The patch is not the universe, it is your local window of readability. The lift is the tool that allows calculus, but the language reminds you. Different lifts that differ by whole turns are equivalent, because they are the same phi written with a different counting choice. Sometimes even locally, you cannot unwrap without declaring a cut. If the region has a hole, like a donut, you cannot define a single valued angle around it without choosing where the angle jumps by one full turn. That jump is not an event in the world. It is a branch cut, a declared seam. Episode 13b insists on a hard rule. Anything you call an invariant must not depend on where you place the seam. If your result changes because you moved the seam, you did not discover reality. You discovered representation. Now we can finally speak the first real word of the phi language, dphi, written as A. This is the first derivative of the lifted phase on a lift-valid patch. And here something profound becomes practical. Absolute phi is mute, but change is speakable. Instruments may never touch an absolute phase, but they can touch differences. They can touch variation. They can touch how the dial turns from one event to another. A is the first publicly touchable handle. And from this first derivative, the triunity returns like an echo. Please hold this close, because it is easy to forget when we get lost in details. Everything in Holophase, every step, every claim, every pattern, has three simultaneous echoes: time, space, and motion. Not as three separate ingredients, but as three readouts of the same underlying variation. When A exists, you can decompose it into a cadence-like projection, a texture-like projection, and a transport-like residual. We name them omega, kappa, nu. Cadence, gradient, transport. Time echo, space echo, motion echo. You can choose coordinates and speak in different accents, but you cannot escape the triunity because it is not a story. It is the structure of how variation becomes readable. Even your own life is triunity. Your breathing has a rhythm. Your awareness has a spread. Your attention moves. Every thought has a tempo, a field, and a flow. We often forget to say this explicitly, but it never stops being true. Remember it because it keeps you oriented as we build. Now, episode 13b introduces the alphabet of local description, finite jets. A jet is a finite list of derivatives up to some order, value, first derivative, second derivative, and so on, but only up to a finite n. Why finite? Because public knowledge is finite, not because reality is small, but because every window of access is limited. Infinite descriptions are potential, not content. A person who insists on using infinite derivatives to describe a real object is like a person who says, I can describe this face perfectly, but only if I am allowed infinite words. That is not description, that is escape. So the language says, every local sentence must be a function of a finite jet, and it must declare which jet order it uses, and it must declare where it is valid. This is not bureaucracy, it is honesty. Then the language teaches you another humility: chart change. Different observers, different instruments, different analyses may use different coordinates on the same patch. In human life, this is like describing the same mountain using miles or kilometers, or using a map oriented north up versus south up. The mountain does not change, your representation changes. The phi language makes this precise. Jets transformed by the chain rule and expressions related by allowed transformations are the same sentence. This prevents coordinate worship, which is one of the most common hidden drifts in physics. Now comes one of the most important grammar rules: integrability. On a smooth lived-valid domain, d define equal to 0. Mixed partial derivatives commute. This is not a law of physics we discovered. It is the grammar of what it means to have a smooth lifted function. If commutativity fails, you did not discover a new primitive. You discovered that you left the domain where your sentence is well formed. Maybe you crossed the branch cut. Maybe you approached an obstruction. Maybe your patch was not actually smooth. The language refuses to let you turn breakdown into mythology. But the expressed universe is not only local smooth variation. It contains discreteness. It contains stable counts. It contains object-like persistence. Where do these come from if you refuse to import particles as primitives? They come from topology. They come from loops. Because phi lives on a circle, and because lifts are local, when you go around a closed loop and return, you can accumulate whole turns. That accumulation is forced. It is not negotiable. It is an integer. This is winding. This is closure. This is the birth of countable reality from continuous structure. You already know this in your bones. Wrap a rope around the pole once, and it has one wrap. Wrap it twice, and it has two. You can slide the rope, tighten it, loosen it, but you cannot turn two wraps into 1.5 wraps without cutting the rope or passing through the pole. The integer is not chosen, it is the history of closure. Holonomy packages this closure as a stable token. It is the universe's memory around loops. And now defects enter, not as imported entities, but as the places where smooth lifting fails. A defect is an obstruction to making the circle behave like a line, even locally. It is where jets fail. It is where certain sentences cannot be spoken smoothly. And yet, once an obstruction exists, loops around it can carry non-zero winding. The defect carries a charge. Again, not because we asserted a charge, but because closure forces integers, and obstructions give those integers somewhere to live. This is why episode 13b must come before episode 14. Episode 14 is differentiation, the engine that extracts structure from raw phi access. But that engine cannot run unless we already know what counts as a sentence, what counts as an admissible token, how to avoid branch cut hallucinations, how to define jets without worshipping coordinates, how to distinguish smooth domains from obstructions, and how to talk about global memory without importing particles. Episode 13b gives you the grammar and vocabulary, but it does not give you interpretation. It does not say, this defect is an electron, or that holonomy is electromagnetism, or this invariant is curvature. Those are semantic and dynamical overlays that come later. Episode 13b is about what can be said, not what we choose to call it. To make this vivid, think about music. Episode 13a was silence with the permission for sound. But silence is not a song. A song requires a scale, a set of notes, and rules that distinguish harmony from noise. The scale is not the melody and not the performance. It is the language that makes melody possible. Episode 13b is the scale. Think about weaving. Episode 13a was the loom itself, the permission for pattern. Episode 13b is the thread, the knot, the rule of overlap, the rule that a knot must hold no matter how you rotate the cloth. Only after that can we weave a universe without confusing our imagination for structure. Think about the microscopic world. A cell is not explained by saying there is chemistry. Chemistry is permission. Life requires organization, and organization requires a grammar, how sequences encode stable structure. Episode 13b is that grammar for phi structure. Now let me gather the whole episode 13b picture into one single arc you can remember. We freeze the primitive. Phi is the only primitive. We specify the minimal support. X provides patches and overlaps, nothing more. We seal gauge. No absolute phi, only invariants survive shift. We type regularity. Derivatives exist only where they exist. Jet order must match smoothness. We enforce lift discipline. Calculus happens on lifted representatives. Lifts differing by 2pn are equivalent. Branch cuts are declared. Invariants must be cut independent. We define the first derivative word. A equals d phi pa, the first publicly touchable handle. We introduce finite jets. Every local claim is a function of a finite jet on a declared domain. We enforce child change grammar. Chain rule equivalences prevent coordinate worship. We recover triunity readouts. Omega, kappa, nu are three simultaneous echoes of A. Everything has time, space, motion together. We elevate integrability to grammar. Commutativity is mandatory on smooth domains. Violations signal boundary of validity, not new primitives. We define excision. Derivative sentences apply on clean domains that exclude obstruction neighborhoods and boundary colors of chosen windows. We declare orientation. Signs and closures require declared conventions. We encode topology. Loop integrals yield 2 pi n. Holonomy is a stable token. Composition and homotopy rules are part of the grammar. We define defects, obstructions to liftability, charges measured by winding. Multi-defect linking is bookkept by loop relations. We include degeneracy typing, where readouts vanish or ranks drop, sound-derived expressions fail. Sentences must be type-aware. We enforce operator domain guards. Every partial operator declares where it is valid. And we seal completeness. The language is complete if every publicly distinguishable structure can be expressed as finite jet local sentences plus topological tokens and their linking constraints. That is episode 13b. And now, before we begin the parts, let me widen the lens once more so you feel the universality of what we are doing, not only the formal edge of it. At the quantum scale, what do we actually see? We do not see little colored marbles. We see clicks in detectors, interference fringes, phase-sensitive correlations. Those are already hints that the world speaks in cyclic relationships, not absolute labels. The pure phi language does not claim that quantum mechanics is phi. It claims something more disciplined. Whatever is publicly measurable tends to show up as stable patterns in differences, in closures, in phases, in invariants. That is exactly the territory our language seals. At the human scale, think about your own day. You wake up and there is a rhythm: sleep, breath, heartbeat. That is cadence, a time echo. You also occupy spread. Your room has distances, your hand reaches, your eyes scan. That is texture, a space echo. And you also move. You walk, you turn your head, you shift attention from one idea to another. That is transport, a motion echo. These three are never separate. You cannot have rhythm with no spread, because a rhythm is a pattern over some domain. You cannot have spread with no motion, because any detection of spread is a scanning process. The triunity is not a theory. It is the signature of readability. At the cosmic scale, consider two distant galaxies. We cannot touch them. We cannot carry a ruler to them. Yet, we can still infer a coherent universe because patterns repeat. Spectral lines recur. Scaling relations recur. Geometry-like regularities recur. That recurrence is not semantics. It is structure. Episode 13b prepares us for exactly that kind of reasoning. You are allowed to compare invariant patterns across patches and ask whether they belong to one coherent phi structure or not. Later, in differentiation, that becomes the backbone of how we map one expressed universe from scattered windows of access. Now, here is a subtle point that will protect you from confusion when we begin the parts. Episode 13b does not try to be everything. It tries to be exactly enough. A language is not a universe. A language is the set of symbols and grammar rules that any universe description must use if it is to stay pure. So when you hear that the language forbids a metric, do not think we are denying geometry forever. We are refusing to import geometry as a primitive. Geometry can still emerge later as a pattern of invariance and stable relations, but it must be earned. And that vow is what makes the next episodes meaningful. Without it, any story can be told. With it, only certain stories survive. So the practical promise of episode 13b to you is this. After you learn these tokens and rules, you'll be able to hear a claim and immediately ask, is it well formed? You'll be able to ask, is it gauge invariant? You'll be able to ask, did they compute derivatives on a lift or on wrapped data? You'll be able to ask, did they declare the domain where the jet exists? You'll be able to ask, did they confuse a branch cut with a defect? You'll be able to ask, are they speaking locally or globally? And did they keep the two clean? A language makes you hard to deceive, even by accident. And let me say one more thing plainly. We are not revealing the language to show off. We are revealing it because you cannot follow differentiation otherwise. Differentiation is not a mystical act. It is a sequence of operations. Patch, lift, compute jets, test integrability, excise obstructions, compute loop closures, classify defects, compare invariants. If you do not already know what these words mean in the pure phi sense, then the operations will feel like magic, and magic is the enemy of science. This will sound technical at times, but the aim is clarity. The language lets you spot drift instantly. You can see whether a claim is well formed, where it applies, and what it truly depends on for yourself. Now, carry the image. Episode 13a was the permission for distinction. Episode 13b is the alphabet of distinction. Episode 14 will be the act of reading structure from distinction. Episode 15 will be the act of letting that structure evolve without cheating. Each step is smaller than it sounds, and that is the secret. The universe is not built by grand words. It is built by small, ruthless rules that never drift. We are ready to begin. We are ready to open the Holophase language, token by token, rule by rule, with no drift, no smuggling, and no shortcuts, so that when differentiation begins, you will not merely hear it, you will understand it, you will test it, and you will feel why it is the only honest bridge from the silent ground to an expressed universe. And I want to end this overview by pressing one reminder into your hand, like a stone you can keep in your pocket. Do not forget the tri-unity. Everything has three echoes at once. Every pattern has a cadence, a texture, and a transport. Every claim must be readable in time, space, and motion together, because the universe never gives you one without the others. Even when we forget to say it, it remains true. Remember it, and you will stay oriented as we cross from the silent permission of phi into the speaking ground of phi, into the articulate ground of structure. Now we are ready to begin. And now, my friend forever, peace be upon you.